If you are a woman working in a male-dominated industry and your HR department tells you a harassment complaint has been fully investigated, do not believe them until you have seen the paperwork yourself. Why I'm telling you this? Because of a single email, one email sent at 11:47 on a Thursday night, from one HR inbox to another, that was never supposed to reach me and that I obtained through a process I am about to describe in precise detail. That email is the reason a settlement was reached. That email is the reason the number on the cheque was not the first number they offered. And that email contains a sentence that I want to read to you because it is the kind of sentence that does not require legal training to understand. It just requires reading it once and sitting with what it means. But first, the before. Because the email only matters in context, and the context is 13 years of a career I built in conditions that were designed, if not explicitly, then structurally, to make building it as difficult as possible. My name is Caroline. I am 44 years old. I spent 13 years working in construction and project management, rising from site coordinator to senior project manager at a mid-sized civil engineering firm in the East Midlands. I was, for the last 4 of those 13 years, the only female senior project manager in the company's regional operation. I want to say that clearly, not as a complaint, but as a structural fact that contextualises everything that follows. 1. Out of 9, for 4 years, in an environment where the site culture, the informal hierarchy and the daily rhythms of the work had been built by and for a specific kind of person, and I was not precisely that person, and managing that gap was a persistent and largely unacknowledged cost of doing the job. The site smelled of diesel and wet concrete and the particular cold of open ground in February, which is a cold that goes through a hard hat and a high vis and settles in the back of your neck for the rest of the day. I wore steel-toed boots that took 3 years to break in properly. I carried a radio and a schedule and the specific authority of someone who has learned to occupy a role that not everyone in the vicinity thinks she should occupy. I was good at it. My projects came in on budget, my safety record was clean, my client relationships were strong. The man responsible for what happened next was a contracts director named Barry. He had been at the company for 11 years and occupied the specific position of someone who is too senior to manage carefully and not senior enough to manage himself. He had a manner with female colleagues that I can only describe as deliberately calibrated. Not overtly hostile, not formally actionable in isolation, but persistent and directional in a way that I recognised from the first week. Comments about my appearance on site, framed as observations, questions about how I was finding the role, asked with a tonal implication that the question contained its own answer, a habit of addressing the men in the room, first in meetings, regardless of agenda, regardless of whose project was under discussion. In September of my 12th year, Barry made a comment in a site meeting that crossed a line I'd been monitoring for some time. 11 people in the room, he said, in response to a scheduling point I had raised, that I was probably better at managing the softer aspects of the job than the technical ones, and that this was why he had positioned me on client-facing work rather than structural. 11 people, half of whom looked at the table, half of whom looked at me. One of whom, a junior site engineer named Tom, later told me, unprompted, in a car park 4 days after it happened, that he wanted me to know he thought the comment had been inappropriate and that he had found it uncomfortable to witness. Tom volunteered that information, in a car park, unprompted. I want you to hold on to Tom. I filed an internal harassment complaint in October. I followed the company's stated procedure, which ran to 4 pages and promised a confidential investigation completed within 28 days. I documented the September meeting comment, 4 earlier incidents I had noted in a personal log I had kept since my 8th year, and 2 email exchanges in which Barry had communicated with me in ways that differed measurably in tone and content from equivalent communications with male colleagues. The complaint was received by HR, acknowledged the same day, assigned to an HR manager named Sandra. 28 days later, I received a letter confirming that the investigation had been completed, that no evidence of conduct constituting harassment under the company's policy had been found, and that no further action would be taken. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. It did not detail what the investigation had involved, who had been interviewed, or what evidence had been reviewed. I asked for the investigation report. Sandra told me there was no formal written report, only a summary finding. I asked to see the summary. Sandra said it was not company practice to share investigation documentation with complainants. I want to stop here, because I want to name what this moment was. This is the moment where most people stop, where the exhaustion of fighting a system from inside the system that employs you, that controls your reference, that determines your next project allocation, becomes heavier than the principal. I know this because I almost stopped. I sat in my car in the company car park for 40 minutes on the day Sandra's letter arrived, and I thought about the mortgage, and the career, and the projects I had coming up, and the 11 people in that room who had looked at the table, and I very nearly decided that the gap between what had happened and what I could prove was too wide to cross. I did not stop, but I want to be honest that stopping was a real option, and I understand why people take it. In January, 3 months after the complaint, 2 months after the investigation closure letter, Barry was involved in an incident on a site I was managing. He attended without prior notice, contradicted my site briefing in front of 3 subcontractors, and then sent an email to the regional director that evening describing my management of the site as creating unnecessary risk for the project's commercial outcome. I was not copied. I received a copy because the regional director forwarded it to me with a request to respond. I was placed on a performance review 2 weeks later. The review cited the commercial risk observation from Barry's email and 2 other performance concerns that were, in my assessment and in the subsequent legal assessment, unsubstantiated and generated after the harassment complaint rather than before it. The performance review ran for 60 days. I met every target. On the 61st day, I was called into a meeting with Sandra and a senior director and told that the company had identified my role as at risk of redundancy in a departmental restructure. Redundancy? 4 weeks later, my position was eliminated. Barry's role was not affected. The regional team continued with 8 senior project managers, all of them male. I contacted ACAS. Early conciliation produced nothing. I instructed a solicitor named Helen, who practiced in employment law in Nottingham and who had the specific and useful quality of becoming very still when she was reading something important. She read my complaint, the investigation closure letter, the performance review documentation, and Barry's email to the regional director. She said the case had strong elements on sexual harassment, victimisation, and unfair dismissal. She filed at the Employment Tribunal in April. The company's defence was comprehensive. They produced the performance documentation, they produced the restructuring rationale, they produced a statement from Sandra confirming that the harassment investigation had been conducted thoroughly and independently. They denied any connection between my complaint and the subsequent performance review or redundancy. Then, Helen filed a data subject access request under the UK GDPR standard tool. Full disclosure of all personal data held about me, including internal communications in which my name appeared. The company had 28 days to respond. They responded in 26 days with a bundle of 411 pages. Helen read every page. On page 342 of the disclosure, in an email thread between Sandra and the head of HR from the week before the investigation closure letter was issued, there was a message sent at 11:47 on a Thursday night. Sandra had written, "I spoke to Barry today and he confirmed this was a personality clash from someone struggling to manage upwards. If we close the investigation now, we can get ahead of it before she escalates." The head of HR had replied the following morning, "Agreed, close it, let's keep this clean." Keep this clean. Helen called me. The morning she found it, she said, "I have the email." I said, "Which one?" She said, "The one that ends this." She said it with the controlled precision of someone who has been in this job long enough to know that documents like this exist somewhere in almost every case, and who has learned to recognise the specific quality of the silence that follows when you find one. We amended the claim to add a specific allegation that the investigation had been conducted in bad faith and that the closure had been coordinated between Sandra and the head of HR with the intent of protecting Barry rather than investigating my complaint. We sought an additional head of compensation for the deliberate concealment. Total claim revised to £71,400. The company's solicitors received the amended claim on a Tuesday. On the Thursday, they made a settlement offer, £45,000, no admission, full confidentiality. I said no. Helen looked at me. She said, "Can I ask why?" I said, "Because the email is going to be read in a tribunal room and someone is going to have to explain the words, 'Keep this clean' in front of a panel, and I want to be in the room when that happens." She said, "Understood." She did not say it in the tone of someone who agreed. She said it in the tone of someone who respects a decision they consider financially risky. I found that distinction clarifying. The hearing was listed for a Tuesday in October. On the Friday before, the company made a revised offer, £68,000. A written statement, not an admission of liability, but a statement drafted by Helen, acknowledging that the investigation into my complaint had not followed the company's own stated process, and that my treatment following the complaint had been inconsistent with the company's equality commitments, a reference that described my professional record in terms I found accurate, and a formal internal review of the harassment investigation procedure to be conducted by an external organisation. I accepted. £68,000 arrived in my account in November. I am now working as an independent project management consultant. I choose my sites, I choose my clients, I choose, for the first time in 13 years, who I have to manage. The steel-toed boots are still in my hallway, broken in properly now. I wore them to a site meeting last week, a meeting where I was the lead consultant, where the room waited for me before beginning, where nobody looked at the table when I spoke. The boots smelled of the same diesel and wet concrete they have always smelled of. The cold came through the same way, but I occupied the room differently, and I knew it, and I want that to be the final note of this story, because it is the only one that feels genuinely resolved. But here is what I cannot resolve. Tom, the junior site engineer who told me in a car park, unprompted, that Barry's comment had been inappropriate and that he had found it uncomfortable to witness. I never used Tom as a witness. Helen assessed that his evidence, while corroborative, was not necessary given the email, and that involving him risked his position at a company where he was still employed. I agreed with that assessment. I agreed with it again when Helen reminded me before the hearing. I agree with it still. But Tom told me something in that car park because he thought it mattered, because he thought bearing witness to something and saying so out loud was the right thing to do, and I protected him from the consequences of that by not asking him to do it formally. I am not certain whether that was the right call. I am not certain whether I would make it the same way again. What would you have done if someone came to you in a car park and said they had seen something that mattered, and you had the power to ask them to say it formally and they might lose their job for doing so? Would you ask? Or would you protect them? And if you protected them, would you wonder, as I do, whether you made their courage smaller by doing so?